Well, welcome back to Return to Yehovah. I want to talk about something 3 days and 3 nights and why it add up. Okay, we've all heard about the 3 days and 3 nights, and there's a very well-known passage in the Bible, Matthew chapter 12, verse 38 through 40, let's say. It starts like this. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, they were talking to Yeshua, and they answered, saying, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." But he answered and said to them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." And then he goes on to say, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Okay, we've all heard that many times and discussed it, I'm sure. And as we're coming up to Passover and Resurrection Sunday and that whole time of year, that's why we're talking about that now, okay? It's coming up in a few weeks here. Now, I believe this is so important that we need to listen to what Yeshua says after what I just read. Okay, so he tells them the Son of Man is going to be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. They probably didn't understand at all what he was talking about, but that's okay. But that was the only sign he was going to give them. Then he goes on to say, Matthew 12:41, he says, "The men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here." He also says, "The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here." So Yeshua's putting some emphasis on this whole thing about the 3 days and 3 nights and the idea of Jonah and the sign of Jonah, as quite a few people refer to it. But until I started putting this study together, I didn't realize that Yeshua had said this twice. Now, it's in Matthew 2 different times. So I don't mean once in one gospel and once in one of the others. I mean in Matthew 2 different times Yeshua said it. Now look at Matthew 16. So about 4 chapters later, it says, "Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and testing him, asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, 'When it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times.'" Then he goes on to say, verse 4 of Matthew 16, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." And he left them and departed. I can't help but think he was ticked off when he left, but it doesn't say that exactly, So he didn't go on in that second time to say 3 days and 3 nights again, but he had already said that a few chapters back, so we know that's what he's referring to, okay? Now I'm wondering if it's so important that Yeshua said it twice, and that it would be the only sign that they would be given. It seems like we should try to understand what he was talking about. We all know that Yeshua was referring to his time, or the time that he'd be in the grave after his death. Okay, all these years later, looking back, we know that he was in the grave, and after he died, and so that is what he was referring to. We also know that he died on Passover, right? We've talked about that, or we know that. But get this, the traditional church answer, for as long as I can remember, and for centuries I'm sure, is just to say that Yeshua died on Good Friday, and then he rose from the grave on Resurrection Sunday. Or sometimes they'll use that other pagan word that begins with an E that I don't like saying. But, so the pastors and teachers and priests, whatever, they tell us, just understand that, it was part of the day on Good Friday, and part, all Saturday maybe, and then part of the day on Sunday the next day, and boom, you got your 3 days. And I don't know about you, but that never sat right with me. That always seemed kind of lame, and I've had conversations with people that questioned about that, and I'm like, well, couldn't really explain it until I found out what I'm going to share with you. I've wondered too, how many people, maybe unbelievers, that asked a Christian friend, hey, what about that? What about that 3-day and 3-night thing? That didn't happen, or how do you explain that? And they, fumble and juggle, the words. I don't, and they just say, well, this is what we're told, tradition of men or whatever, but it doesn't answer the question. And people go away, and I wonder how many turned their back and said, I don't want anything to do with that religion. They say things, but they can't, prove it from their own scriptures, Anyhow, we're going to see here that the truth is right in our Bibles. And if you don't know, it's because you haven't been taught. Teachers, preachers, whatever, don't know it themselves. They haven't seen it for themselves, so they can't share it with you. All right, and that to me is kind of a scary thought. But let's go to the foundation of God's Word, the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, and specifically we're going to look at Leviticus chapter 23. Okay, now there's plenty of places we could look, but just, like everything, I have to focus on a part of things to make a point. Leviticus 23 verse 1 says, And the Lord spoke to Moses, or Yehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feasts of Yehovah, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. These are my feasts. Okay, that's what God says. Then, the next verse, he says, 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. There's that phrase again. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of Yehovah in all your dwellings. Now, you might think for a second that, okay, that's talking about the weekly Sabbath, and it is, but I wanted to include that partly because it's right there, and it's a holy convocation, so it's an important gathering or time in God's way of reckoning, okay? And it'll play into the whole thing as we get going here. Verse 4 of Leviticus 23 says, God goes on to say, These are the feasts of Yehovah, again, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. We've all heard that, the idea, an appointed time with God or something like that. The feasts are his appointed times, and he wants us to remember them and to keep them as best we're able to, but he really would like us, it's crucial that we do it on the time or, the days that he says. Now, I'm not here to discuss, the different ways all of us, think to keep the calendar right now. I get it. We don't know exactly how to do it. So there's, to my knowledge, right now, there's at least 3 different ways that people are keeping the calendar of God this particular year. Some started a month ago. Some will be starting the new year this month. and some believe, Passover is on a set day, and some were waiting for the moon to be seen and all that, So, like I say, that's at least three different ways, that people are, all trying to do the best they can. So this is not about nailing down the way to keep the calendar, okay? But I'm trying to point out that the time and the dates are crucial. They matter to God, okay? Not so much for us today as much as in the times when Yeshua lived. It was crucial. Now keep in mind, those feasts were given to Moses and the children of Israel after they came out of Egypt, right? But was it 1,500 years later when Yeshua was walking the earth and eventually died on Passover and all of that? So let's look at that real quick, okay? I guess what I'm trying to say is, before I said that, is God gave it to them 1,500 years before, so that they would remember those days related to coming out of Egypt and all that entails with the Passover and eating the unleavened bread and all of that, okay? But fast forward to the time of Yeshua on the earth, those times were crucial, and they needed to, be understood. Hopefully this will make sense in a few minutes here. All right, so let's look at Passover. Leviticus 23, verse 5. Now God says, on the 14th day of the first month at evening is Yehovah's Passover, or the Lord's Passover. So he picked the 14th day of the month, and he said at evening, or just, as the sun was going down or getting ready to go down or whatever, okay? Now you can look at Exodus chapter 12 for details about when the Passover was killed and, a lot of that stuff. I don't want to get off on that for this purpose, okay? But remember, when the sun goes down on the evening of the 14th, that is actually also turning into the beginning of the 15th of the month, okay? Now, the 15th, God will tell us in a second, begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread, okay? Now, Leviticus 23:6 says, and on the 15th day of this same month, so really the day after the Passover, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to Yehovah. And he says, 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day of those 7, you shall have a holy convocation. So again, there's that same phrase that he referred to the feasts, and he even called the Sabbath a holy convocation. It's like a special set-apart gathering, or some say it's like a dress rehearsal, okay? But just remember that phrase for now, holy convocation. So he says, on the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So you can't work that day. It's like a Sabbath. Different people may refer to it different ways, but think of it as an extra Sabbath, okay? He goes on to say in verse 8, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. Now that's something we can't do now, but just that's part of the verse. Then he says, the 7th day of those 7 days of the feast, the 7th day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So he's telling you, whenever this 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread plays out, the first day is a Sabbath. It doesn't mean a Saturday. It just means it's a day of no work. And then the 7th day, whenever that is, would be a day of no work. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully. All right, so that's kind of some background that we need to know. Now, I know this is something that is not talked about in churches. I've been to several different churches over my walk here, in different denominations and everything. I never heard anything like this, In fact, we barely even mention the Sabbath, It's just not even discussed, But so it's possible there could be 2 extra Sabbaths, depending on when they fall. And I mean, yes, somebody will say, well, wait a minute, what if one of those, either the first day or the 7th day, was actually the weekly Sabbath? Well, then yes, it would still be a Sabbath, So I mean, either way. But if it lands on a day that is not the Sabbath, on the the Saturday Sabbath, you still are not supposed to work, okay? So just keep that in mind. All right. Now, we know that Yeshua died on Passover, which was the 14th day of that first month. Then the next day, the 15th, would have been the first day of this unleavened bread feast. First day of that, and a special Sabbath. We also know that Yeshua rose from the grave on a Sunday. Okay, I'm just laying down the different little pieces we do know. Now that day is called the first day of the week, and you'll see that sometimes in the Gospels. But keep in mind, the weekly Sabbath is always the 7th day of the week, we call Saturday. But the next day, the very next day, is the first day of the new week, okay? So, like really, when the sun goes down on Saturday evening, it is technically not Saturday anymore. It's considered Sunday, or the first day of the week, okay? We might look at some other parts of that, separately in another video. Not sure yet, but all right, so let's get to the 3 days and 3 nights. Now, years ago, it was suggested to me, what if Yeshua died on a Wednesday? Now, keep in mind, I had been, raised and learned for decades or whatever, he died on Good Friday, right? We all were told that, but, it was suggested maybe it was a Wednesday, or what if it was a Wednesday? And I was like, well, it was pretty shocking, okay? But when this was laid out for me, it made a lot of sense. So imagine, go back to that week when Yeshua was nailed to the cross on Passover on the 14th day of the first month. What if that day, Passover, fell on a Wednesday? Okay? Hear me out. Now we know Yeshua would have been on the cross from about 9 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's what it says. Once it was determined that he was dead, the 2 men, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, came, took his body off the cross, wrapped him in a cloth, and laid it in Joseph's tomb where no man had ever laid. Okay, and then they would have, closed the, somehow rolled the stone across it and all that stuff. And but all that had to be done before sundown. Okay, and that, if you think about what we just talked about, because when the sun goes down, that is the new day, which is a Sabbath. It's the first day of unleavened bread, but it's also the time when they would have been, with their families to actually eat the Passover meal, okay? Now, we know in retrospect that Yeshua was our Passover lamb and all that, but at the time, the people were still, keeping those things, and they would have, somebody in their families most likely would have, taken the lamb and had it slaughtered and prepared the meal and all that. And of course, as a little side note, I don't want to get, into too much speculation, but most likely these 2 men, since they had touched Yeshua's body, the body of a dead person, they would have been unclean. So they probably, they definitely would have been ceremonially unclean. And without me digging through and just making sure I got it specific from Scripture, most likely they would not have been able to eat the Passover meal, but, who knows what they were thinking of at that time. The main thing is they knew that they had to get home before sundown, because if nothing else, they could not, they could not work past sundown, all right? That's just, these were devout men that kept the Torah, kept God's commandments, okay? So it's crucial that they would have, one way or the other, been done before sundown and been back home or whatever. Especially in those days, you don't want to be, caught out walking by some Pharisee or somebody. They might have stoned you or whatever. Anyhow, now I want to try to look at from God's and Yeshua's perspective, what was going on. Now, I'm not going to be able to get into some of the hidden spiritual incredible things that might have been going on that we won't know till we get to heaven. All right, but just hear some of the things that they would have known about, or God would have been attesting to. Okay, first, Yeshua died on Wednesday, the Passover. Okay, He was resting in the tomb on a Sabbath. Just think about that for a second. The Sabbath is supposed to be a day of rest, and he's called the Lord of the Sabbath. But here he is in the tomb, and he is literally resting on the first day of unleavened bread, which is a special Sabbath. So I just think that's kind of cool. He's resting on a Sabbath. We don't know, was he down, dealing with demons down in Gehenna or in paradise? I mean, I honestly have no idea, so I don't want to speculate, all right? But this Sabbath I just mentioned would have been a Thursday that week, right? Next, the next day was Friday. Now that would have been the preparation day for the weekly Sabbath. And they still call it that today. Friday is considered the preparation day before a special holiday, or for sure before the weekly Sabbath. Now imagine Yeshua's mother, the disciples, and the women that came with them from Galilee. I think I said this in an earlier video, but they were all visiting from out of town, and since there's only certain, you cannot go to a store or to a market to buy things to eat or drink or whatever you might need on the Sabbath. You just do not do that. Okay, so Friday would have been the day they would have had to go and get the things they might need, and even prepare some things to have them ready, so that when the Sabbath began on Saturday, they could actually, have their meals and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so these people were devout, and they followed the law as best they knew, and so they would have been keeping these commandments, all right? Then the next day after that was Friday, then the next day would have been Saturday, or the weekly Sabbath, right? It technically begins at sundown on Friday and goes until sundown on what we call Saturday evening, all right? So, I want to add this all up. Yeshua was in the grave all day Thursday and Thursday night, all day Friday and Friday night, and then all day Saturday and Saturday night. Now, keep in mind, that doesn't mean like till midnight or till the first rays of light came up on Saturday or on Sunday morning. That's not what it means. As we've talked about in other videos, sundown is when a day begins. So Friday night at sundown begins the Sabbath. But when the sun goes down again on Saturday evening, even though it's dark, that's the next day. That is Sunday, or the first day of the week. Okay, hopefully you're following that thing. I made a rough chart. Let me just try to show this. Sorry for, the high-tech stuff, but as you can see, we've got Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Sabbath, and Sunday at the bottom there. And each one of those blocks, of course, is a day. But the 14th was Passover. Unleavened bread day 1 was the next day. Unleavened bread, or ULB I called it, 2. And unleavened bread 3. Not that we have to keep counting all 7 of them, but I just wanted you to see Yeshua would have been in the grave all day Thursday and Thursday night, all day Friday and Friday night, and all day Saturday. And when the sun went down, it's a little rough here, but and I like to say at the first tick of the clock past sundown, God would have said, come out, however that would have occurred. But Yeshua would have, angel would have rolled away the stone or whatever. They were probably waiting, watching, they don't have watches, of course, but they would have been waiting to the order, okay, time's up, the Sabbath is done. And they would have, rolled that stone away. He would have come out, and that would have, begun the resurrection. Okay, but for this purpose, there's so much more you can say. This whole thing of Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection is just chock full of, prophetic and incredible information. But, I'm just trying to point out that it's very easy to show, using the knowledge from the Torah, that it's 3 days and 3 nights if Passover happened on a Wednesday, okay? Now, I have heard some people speculate, oh, maybe it was a Thursday, and they do some juggling, and they may be able to argue that it's, a way that makes it sound really good. I don't know. I did not come up with this. I actually heard this from a good friend of mine, and at the time he was a pastor of the church I was going to. His name was Mark Biltz with El Shaddai Ministries. He didn't come up with it. I can't remember exactly who he said he learned it from, but when he learned it, he shared it with a bunch of us. And of course, when I first heard that, man, that just blew my mind, because it finally, something that I couldn't explain was right there. And if people wanted to argue, I could say, well, it's in the Bible, I mean, granted, the Word of God does not say Passover was a Wednesday. We get it, okay? But it's not hard to just add the days till you get to where you need to get. Anyhow, it just hammers home the point that Yeshua, who said this 2 different times, as recorded in the book of Matthew, it was like, kind of important. And how crazy is that followers of Yeshua for centuries have never been able to just get that to make sense or add that up, I mean, that just kills me. But that, obviously the enemy tricked us, coming up with this Good Friday baloney and all that, and trying to make us, I mean, we fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, okay? But I just think, as much as he stressed it, I mean, he sounded pretty angry both times that he said it. He said, an evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign. And he said, the only sign you're going to get is the sign of Jonah. And then he explains, as he was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. So if you hadn't heard this before, now you get this in your head, learn it, and then you can explain it to other people. I mean, I'm not taking credit for any of this. I did not come up with it, okay? But, I mean, that is one of the most amazing things for me. One of these little pieces from learning the feasts of the Lord and seeing it in your own Bible, and then being able to, explain so much more. And I think there's a lot that went on in the, the gospel accounts of Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection. And I might do some more, just especially just even talking about Resurrection Day, or the first day of the week, because I didn't go into any detail in this one, but the Sunday, the first day of the week that he came out, is also called the Feast of First Fruits. It's or the Day of First Fruits. I've heard different ways of mentioning it, so maybe we'll talk about that another time, because I got a little bit longer than I was hoping to, but I didn't want to split this into 2 or 3 chunks. I mean, it just, to me, this is a just incredible, cool thing from the Bible, and hopefully it makes sense to you guys. And I don't know, feel free to comment if you disagree or whatever, but I learned this probably about, 13 years ago, and it stuck with me. I mean, I don't need to look it up again. I can just spell it out, and just because it sunk in, okay? So there's a confidence you can have when you can understand and deal with things that people could dispute from the Word, and you can say, hello, here's how it probably happened, okay? Anyhow, I'll close for now, but Yehovah bless you and keep you. Shalom.